Welcome to H. France's webinar. The topic this semester is Writing the History of Empire, Past Approaches and New Perspectives. And this is a very popular topic in the historiography of France these days. And we will have Professor Eric Jennings of the University of Toronto, who will lead us in this seminar discussion. And Eric needs no introduction. Everyone will know his very popular, well-received book, Vichy in the Tropics, 2001, by Stanford University Press. And more recently, he has come out with a book, Dalat, The Making and Undoing of French Indochina. We're also joined by, that came out in 2011. We're also joined by Alice Conklin, who wrote an enormously influential book in 1997, Mission to Civilize, The Republican Idea of Empire in France and West Africa, 1895 to 1930. More recently, she's written In the Museum of Man, Race, Anthropology, and Empire in France from 1850 to 1950. And that is coming out this year from Cornell University Press. And finally, we're joined by Laurent Dubois, who has written many books about the Caribbean and Caribbean history of the late 18th century, including two titles that have been very helpful for those of us who studied the French Revolution but knew little about what was going on the other side of the Atlantic in the French colonies. It's Avengers of the New World, the story of the Haitian Revolution, and A Colony of Citizens, Revolution and Slave Emancipation. And more recently, he has written a book called Soccer Empire, the World Cup and the Future of France. So we'll begin by turning things over to Eric. And as many of you know or have joined us, there were readings that were put up on H. France, and that will be the basis of our discussion today, although we might move beyond those. And so Eric, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for this. It's the first time I do a seminar quite this way, so I can imagine that there will be some awkward silences and so on. Laurent, we didn't have a chance to discuss this with you, but Alice and I were thinking that perhaps the teaching question could come at the end, but otherwise we could maintain the order of the other questions, if that makes sense. So, which brings us to the question about the Gregory Mann article that we had on the Indochina. So Mann argues that the Indochina, quote, enabled the fiction that institutions and procedures prevailed over individuals and practices, end of quote. He also uses the term alibi to describe the Indochina. In what ways are fiction and alibi useful terms of analysis for understanding colonial violence in West Africa, or for that matter, the Indochina more generally? Thoughts? Questions? Obviously, there's been quite a bit of work on the Indochina of late, and one could have done this in dialogue with Isabelle Merle's piece. There's a lot of different, as Alice and I were saying before we started this seminar, there's a lot of talk on the role of law right now, so this is one of the ways of getting us started on a piece that really engages as much with African history as it does with French colonial history.
Yeah, please feel free, students, to raise some questions about the Mann article. Is this the first time fiction has been used in the context of colonial or imperial history? Is this a new way of using the concept of fiction?
Well, certainly I think people have taken the Indochina seriously as a concept. The question is, how amorphous is it? And one of the good things about this article is that it interrogates exactly who was and wasn't eligible for the Indochina. Were women included? Were tirailleurs included? Which is to say former combatants of African origin? Were citizens included? Obviously not. children. Who exactly fell under the umbrella of the Indochina? So if it is this all-encompassing arc that is supposed to explain the colonies, then why so many exceptions? How did it actually work? Which actually gets us sort of to the next question that Alice formulated, but it seems to me, is one of the reasons this is so interesting. So the question then becomes, indeed, is this an institution? Is it an artifice? Is it an alibi? What exactly is the Indochina?
Yeah, can I jump in for a second?
Please do, yes.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the key things here is, and it's one that stretches across all different imperial contexts, is the question of how we use law as historians, right? I mean, and I think that's partly what's interesting here, is the question of, obviously legal texts and courts and so forth generate enormous archives. They're texts that are very accessible, and at the same time, as we know, they can be very problematic in terms of actually kind of understanding a society from that basis. So I mean, just to throw that out, because I think there's a parallel with similar types of debates we have in thinking about, say, how you write the history of slavery and the extent to which you know, kind of something like the Code Noir or other types of things are useful or not as artifacts for that, and then what are the techniques? So I mean, I guess another addition, you know, the part of the question is how man uses certain techniques to interrogate that question, and you know, whether those are useful techniques and so forth. So.
Can I say something? I think when I reread Man last night, what struck me is he's also reacting or positioning himself in a larger historiography or debate about the role of law in empire, which and I like the way he does it, because he builds on it and also not questions, but just interrogates whether we are making assumptions that we haven't necessarily been aware of. In other words, does talking about law, which is such a rich topic, and specifically things like legal records can be so important for social history, does it obscure in some ways the violence? I think that's what was interesting to me, that the Indochina, and that's where the fiction comes in, that if we talk too much about law, we're getting away from something. It sounds so rational and ordered in some ways. What's so important about understanding colonial society from the bottom up is how violent it was.
But the question I had, you know, if Greg were here, I would ask him, well, can we clarify who the fiction's for? Is the fiction just for, is it really just a fiction that's operative for Europeans? Or is the fiction, does it have traction for the people who experience it? I get the sense that people are experiencing the arbitrariness and the violence, and the fiction is really for domestic consumption back in Europe.
Well, you could ask the question, you know, fiction, alibi, we used to call that window dressing, and I mean, are these terms all dancing around the same question, which is how are certain things obscured discursively through the creation of the opposite, let's say. And I think it's clear that it's very hard to get away, if you use a word like fiction, from what I remember my advisor calling window dressing. No, I think the man is very subtle in how he uses the term, that it's a necessary fiction, which is very important within the colonial situation. It's not only for domestic consumption. It's not ideology. It's something else.
Am I right to think that Jenna has her hand raised? Am I reading the chart correctly?
Yeah, Jenna, you need to click your Control F2 button.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. I would agree that, to me, fiction and alibi have this connotation of window dressing, and I think that can be problematic because it separates out, when we're talking about the connections between metropole and colony, I think it can separate those out. You know, there's the reality of what's happening on the ground, and then there's the fiction that's being papered over it. But I think Mann, by looking at much more at practices, is showing that an alibi is not just a fiction. It's something that makes the whole system tenable. And I think it gets at that tension between the liberal state and violence. And there's actually a book I would bring up from, let's see who the author is. I have it sitting right here. It's called Alibis of Empire. It's about the British Empire by Colonial Montana. But it covers kind of the earlier period, the earlier 1800s, where the liberal state is emerging along with empire. And I think it's addressing that question of how the compatibility between the liberal state and violence, and I think alibi is maybe a useful word at getting to get at.
There is I would say there's an interesting point about, I'm trying to remember the exact quote. Gary Wilder, in one of his recent articles, uses an Adorno quote about taking an object more seriously than it takes itself, or kind of, I'm forgetting exactly the quote, but there's an interesting way certainly in the Caribbean, that even if legal codes are to some extent put together as a kind of window dressing, if you want, people then take them more seriously than sometimes in the colonial government does, or people find fissures within them or find uses for them. And certainly the Code Noir was a case of that, where kind of the Code Noir was really very rarely applied, but oddly enough, like during the Haitian Revolution, they used the Code Noir as a way of arguing against, certain policies. So I do think there's that too, which is the kind of, let's say, the unintended consequences of certain legal forms because of practice, right? And the way that, and the kind of seriousness with which sometimes the colonized actually take law. Certainly in the Caribbean, Rebecca Scott's work has emphasized this quite a bit, that, almost any opening in the legal structure would find itself exploited. I'll cite like Malek Gatcham's recent book on Haiti, which is a great example of that. So that, and I think Mann emphasizes that too. But there's a kind of unpredictability of what's going to happen around law, which again makes it important to think of it not exclusively as, because the fact is it's not like just a pamphlet, right? It has kind of, it's meant to be put into practice, and so then it leaves opening for certain kinds of practices that other discursive forms don't. So.
If it is a pretext or an alibi or a fiction, it's a fairly all-encompassing one. Just on the basis of this article, not even bringing in to bear other readings, you can see that it's invoked for prestation, for corvée, for all sorts of coercive forms. It's also brought to bear in a murder case. It's something that is routinely invoked as a framework for dealing with everyday incidents, major incidents, etc. So it seems to me that he does take it seriously. The question is, how is it deployed? When is it used?
And how does it work in conjunction with that, formal legal system, which in some ways you're invoking Laurent with the Code Noir? That the French actually put in place a set of, certainly a set of courts that are in many ways this distortion yet again of what obtains in the metropole, but and which, if you want to continue the comparison with the Code Noir, are there to, the prescriptions are there to police French behavior as much as they are, to channel a certain kind of behavior on the part of the colonized. So and that's what I like, the way he puts those two together, so they sort of need each other. So he moves, he's moving beyond just looking at the formal courts and how those are used, and the fissures and the unintended consequences, to this exceptional regime of law that really has no rational legal quality to it.
One thing that occurred to me throughout the article is, can you say the same about the Indochina in New Caledonia, in Indochina, in Madagascar? Because it does have many permutations and variations, right? And so obviously there's a focus here on West Africa, and an interesting sub-focus on the town of San, which is sort of recurring through the article. But I wondered about the transferability of some of these concepts. Do any of you have thoughts on that?
Well, I think he says that Indochina is different. I mean, there is
Right.
a white prestige issue that is and I think he's quite clear, because I don't know about the Madagascar. I mean, I know he argues he has a slightly different interpretation than Isabelle Merle and their reading of Foucault, that this is a very clumsy and system that, the colonial state is so weak, it can't possibly make people internalize the discipline. And I think that often comes back, that kind of claim about Africa, that it is a weaker, later, and different kind of state than Indochina or Algeria, and for the Caribbean in the 19th century, I know not that much use.
Yeah, but I think Alice, that's where the different readings tie in together, because you can make this claim that the state here is relatively weak. It's no panopticon, whereas Cliff in some ways Cliff Rosenberg negotiates with questions of colonial modernity, and at the end of the day, there is such a thing as colonial modernity and experimentation. So I think the different readings come down on different sides on this.
Well, I thought about it a little bit about what you're trying to explain here. I think Greg is an Africanist who's a wonderful practitioner of the local, the specific.
Right.
And it raises another question it's the big question always of colonial history, top down, bottom up. I don't think they're mutually exclusive approaches at all. But depending which vantage point you take, you're going to come up with a different set of sources, certainly, and perhaps different conclusions.
Can I just interject a question before? As I know we have plenty of questions on the list, but
Okay.
One of the questions that sprang to mind is I noticed in both of these articles, Cliff's and Greg's, that they struck me as more top down. We're not getting the experience, agency, and appropriation of forms of power being applied upon an agent who responds. Now, does it just happen to be these two works, or do you see is there a trend in colonial or imperial history that is focusing now more on the top?
Well, first of all, I think that's a great question to open up people. Do you agree with Chuck? Because I would say, even though Greg's is interested in the formal apparatus, what comes across is that the memory of colonial rule for the people of San is the absolute indignity of being subjected to the indigena. That it's a very gritty, in some ways, article that puts that up, certainly much more than my work ever did, the kind of everyday violence, and that was actually the voice or the perspective he was writing from, which took him all the way to the top. So it's not that I would just disagree slightly with your characterization of too top down, but I do think they both have aspects of the top, right?
Yeah, I mean, much the same question could be asked about Laurent Dubois' excellent chapter. Is this giving agency to Maurice Trésor and Thierry Henry and company, or is it really about the FIFA, CONCACAF, etc.? Well, obviously the answer is largely the former more than the latter.
I mean, I do think this is kind of a vital question, because it's interesting because it raises these kind of ethical conundrums as well, right? And I think that's and it's the same sort of thing again. I keep referring to slave studies, but it's a kind of like one feels an obligation to obviously talk about the violence of the system, right, and the systemic structural forms of violence exclusion, at the same time as one wants to tell the history of the people subjected to that as full human stories, right, which also means their negotiation, their resistance, their ability to carve out spaces that, that were perhaps even liberatory within this. Sometimes their actual, use of colonial structures to their own advantages. I mean, all these sorts of things, right? And there's the kind of ethics to that. In other words, how does one balance the kind of need for critique of the structure with a kind of maybe a humanistic desire to recall certain stories that are, that go beyond that structure. I mean, I think it's a really interesting problem, and I think maybe for the students to think about as they embark on their projects, what is the point in some ways of telling the story, right? Is it to condemn and describe a certain colonial structure, or perhaps to find, inspiration for the ways that they were subverted? I mean, I think, and many of us, I think, are constantly kind of moving back and forth between those poles a little bit, right? And each person has to figure out where to land on it, I think, to some extent. But there are also obviously maybe movements within the field that push people in one direction or another at different periods. So.
Yeah. Yeah, what I appreciated in Greg's article was, there is a lot of work on the more subtle forms of power in the colonial situation, and he's reminding us, no, this can be brute force. This can be quite nasty, and there may be room for agency here, but there's also, with the fiction of the law, there's the creation of social categories that people experience too. So this fiction is not just window dressing, but socially constitutive.
It also begs the question, this is returning to a point that Alice made, of just how much the colonial state actually wields and exercises real control in small locales, right? You can look at Fred Cooper's point about enumeration in the colonies, for instance. What does the administration actually know? Gregory has this interesting little sub-point about the administrator suddenly getting a car in 1942-43, thereby making his tournée easier, which does beg the question of how much control is being exerted, how much the Indochina is actually being applied in more remote locales.
Well, in places that you have a thin state, such as where the places that Greg is looking at, one wonders, does it make sense to talk about a state, or could these stories almost be told in terms of individuals on the ground? Is there a state?
Well, there's certainly an incredible amount of arbitrary power wielded by the local commandant, which I think is part of the story, and it's one that's easy to forget when you talk about colonialism.
Or even the law, right? I mean,
right.
yet there are, as we know from Richard Roberts' work, there's a lot of very interesting use of the courts the French do set up, which is by women, for example. I mean, by people within African society who are interested in change, not necessarily the kind of change that the colonial state is interested in. So you have to keep, always have to juggle the multiple aspects. I think that was Laurent's point of not being unrelentingly bleak about the enormity of power and violence to the extent of somehow leaving out the individual experiences of resistance. So.
Right.
Greg has done some great work. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to jump in and say that the question about can we talk about a state is something I was thinking about reading this, because I think it's in Greg Mann's article, or perhaps one of the other ones, but there's the author makes the point that we're talking about a great deal of different colonial places that we sometimes lump together as colonies, but there's projectors, and even within the same colony proper, we're talking about Saint Louis or Dakar is going to be very different than a rural area. So that I think would be an interesting direction for people to think more about. What is colonialism? Can we even talk about one French colonialism or one French empire if we're talking about all these different relationships between individuals?
Yeah.
Jenna, I remember, because Jenna's advisor was Jim Searing, who tragically passed away recently, who was an inspiration to me too, because we were fellow graduate students together. And I can remember Jim saying, colonial state, what is the colonial state? And it was like, because we would, even then, and that was in the mid-'80s, I was discussing this entity that people were taking for granted. And you have the same problem with the colonial project. You know, is it some monolithic thing that we all know about, or actually have no idea what it is? We just invoke it.
Yeah, Jenna's point is an excellent one, and in West Africa there's obviously the quatre communes that complicate everything. There's all sorts of exceptional statuses that complicate everything in just about every territory you can imagine in the French colonies, right? Think of Indochina and you know, the kingdom, the colony, the protectorate. All of these statuses do have meanings, right?
I was struck by, I mean, I've been reading, Greg Mann has been wrote some great stuff about Mali, the contemporary kind of, you know, situation in Mali, and a blog called Africa as a Country and Elsewhere. And I was at a conference in Dakar, and reading this article reminded me of this, where it was interesting, you know, the situation in Mali was being discussed, and of course the history of French colonialism and French intervention was being discussed, but it was also interesting how often the position, if you think about different geologies of kind of history, that in that context, much older histories having to do with essentially with North Africa and West Africa, with Islam and, you know, and Sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, were evoked much more commonly, and in a way that actually at times you sort of realize that on some level the French presence was this tiny little experience that left a mark, of course, but it's also, there's ways that sometimes history of West Africa can be told in a way that actually marginalizes the French presence in a positive way, you know, to some extent, that the kind of like, that the problem is actually a much older problem, and that the role of the French in this is just to have kind of at one point played a historical role in a deeper relationship, which was problematic. So and I'm talking about like Senegalese historians essentially situating it that way, and even evoking French Empire in ways that as an American scholar sounded very surprising, you know, sort of, in other words, evoking the ways in which French Empire freed slaves, for instance, you know, in 19th century Mali and that kind of stuff. So I throw that out there partly because I think there's also the question of how much agency we give to the colonial project. You know, I mean, there's sort of how do Africans today see that colonial project? And sometimes, you know, that relationship, we assume that it's always kind of takes the primary role, but there are, of course, lots of other narratives to be told about Africa. I'm just throwing out that as another problem of this scale.
Well, that's really fascinating, because this suggests then that doing colonial history can epistemologically challenge us in the way we tell the historical stories about various places where European countries set up shop around the world. So I don't know if you have an example, but is there a narrative on the ground in Dakar that makes us think about the categories we use and what empire means? Do these locally produced narratives destabilize the story we tell about the nation state in Europe and its imperial reach?
I mean, I do think that even the questions of like who's a descendant of slave versus slave holders, for instance, within West Africa, like as far as family genealogies, for instance, which is a really interesting part of how society functions there, but also just the way in which, you know, the way that some of the conversations I was in went was partly like, oh yeah, well we've obviously at certain points used the French, or the, you know, it has been useful to us or different groups to have the French around to do certain things, right? Or certain projects have been served by the French, you know, presence as they are being served in Mali today. But it was just an interesting, you know, and of course other people in the conversation saw it extremely differently. So I'm not saying that was hegemonic, but it is interesting that, I mean, I think we always have to question to what extent, by taking the category of the colonial as the major category, you know, we might be forgetting about other types of, right, of history. I mean, I'm influenced in this by, I mean, Bruce Hall's work, for instance. Bruce is a colleague here, you know, on these kind of long-term ideas of race in West Africa. You know, it's just, there's these also, I think we're at a point, interestingly, where there's various kinds of decenterings going on, which I think Greg Mann's piece is part of, because of course Greg always, I think, insists precisely on a very rooted, a story that's really rooted in African local realities. I mean, even if it's about the colonial context, you know, and reacting to things that he thinks maybe are too centered on, you know, on kind of the French projection of power as opposed to its actual mechanisms. And I do think the local variation is key, because it's just like a place like Timbuktu is not Dakar, is not Saint Louis, and the way in which law functioned within the different spaces of West Africa was very varied, and I think that's another point, to recall, just that, so yes, I think there was a colonial state in certain places that had a certain kind of weight, and then in other places it was probably extremely marginal, right, in terms of shaping people's daily lives. So I'll stop at this.
Yeah. Shall we move down the list of questions here? And
sure.
And
sure.
Please, students, feel free to raise questions or comments.
So the second question down the list is, how can we best use colonial sources to write a social history of empire? Is that what man is attempting to do?
Maybe the students have an idea of what kind of sources they speak to them most. I think there were a group of students here taking a course on imperial or global or colonial history. What kinds of sources tend to speak to you as students of this topic?
If I could jump in, Burley Hendrickson from Northeastern University. I was reading Greg's article and thinking that, in fact, I think he really is trying to do a social history using colonial and legal sources, which is really tough, but he's sort of a prisoner of the sources and relegated to that based on his period of study, I think, in many ways. And I'm looking at 1960s university protests in Dakar and elsewhere. But one of the things that I'm able to do because of the sort of presentness of the project is actually conduct interviews, which I think is, something that's available to people looking at the post-colonial era, but not the case for others. So that's one source, and it's also led me to political tracts written by the sort of new left in Africa at the time, to the extent I can find them as sort of sources writing against the state and against state-run newspapers. But those are kind of few and far between. And if you're really looking at rural regions, it's pretty hard to come up with these sources. So I'd be curious how others get around that for these earlier periods and for trying to incorporate rural areas that I know also Juliet Nancy Smith has been speaking to that for the Maghreb as well, how to not be so city-centric.
It's a very good question. Part of the answer obviously has to do with the fact that Greg has used oral sources for his other work. I'm thinking of Native Sons, right, where he does deeply engage with oral history. But I think you're right. The chronology here dictates otherwise. From some of my current projects, I've stumbled upon treasure troves of letters of complaints to the Governor General and those sorts of things, which are obviously helpful in reconstituting local problems. But then, who's mediating them, who's filtering them, who's writing them becomes the question. Any thoughts from the other panelists on sources?
Well, I know, as I said, I've already brought up court cases as one example of how you can get transcripts, once again, of voices that seem, closer to, or mediated always to the colonial state, but perhaps closer to some of the issues that really concern the Africans who are using these courts. But I would evoke again Jim Searing's work, where he was doing deep ethnography, oral history and memory, questioning. It requires learning the language of, but he was an Africanist by training, a Senegalese historian of Senegal. So again, it depends where you situate yourself on the spectrum of scholar of colonialism, from, it seems to me, one end, which is as an Africanist whose first commitment is to recovering the story from exactly what the perspective Laurent was talking about, the story in which their history, their memory is not necessarily shaped by the contours of the colonial world that we, or someone like myself has studied, the periodization driven by events in France, and so, but that is it's one of the ironies that to do that kind of history, you have to, we're all being urged to produce more work more quickly, and it's the kind of work that takes a lot of time and embeddedness in a non-written, non-literary archive.
Well, here's a kind of source that bridges the two. I think the two types of sources we're talking about. Kelly Brignac of Vanderbilt University writes that I think that diaries and journals are great sources because they are private. You can get into the head of a single person. And she is working on the diary of Pierre Dessalles, Martinique, right now. And I understand much more about Martinican society than I would if I had looked at laws, petitions, etc. Of course, looking at ego documents poses problems of its own, but if approached carefully, they can be very useful. Yeah,
I would certainly wholeheartedly agree, yes.
I'll add another thing. I mean, obviously for the Haitian Revolution, we don't get to do oral histories, unfortunately, but although, interestingly, there's a whole realm in which is the realm of religion in Haitian Voodoo, where there actually is this kind of interesting communication with spirits from the past that kind of goes on. And so one of the projects we've been doing here is in terms of looking at Voodoo song, which is this huge corpus in which there's like a lot of very detailed historical kind of references made to the revolution, and then within Voodoo temples people tell history, there's oral histories that often refer to the revolution, which is this kind of central thing. What's interesting, I think, in different kinds of sources is that especially those sorts of sources also challenge us to think about historicity in rather different ways, so that I recently did a paper I was basically looking at Haitian Voodoo for references to the moment of Haitian independence, right? And there are some references to Dessalines and so forth, but there's also just a whole different kind of narration of the historical process that actually puts political processes on the side and evokes cultural processes that are more longue durée, that certain moments like the slave trade are evoked, or so there's a kind of, in those sorts of sources, it's less about trying to find empirical information than thinking about how it challenges our notions of historical time, which does go back to the earlier discussion about the, Africanists and colonial historians often have this debate, like what's our temporality, right? What's our sense of the meaningful breaks and time and those sorts of things. So I think, and that's a really interesting discussion to have, just generally as historians, how do we think of chronology? I think on the question of, of course, the issue of diaries in the slave context is that there is a way in which they tend to come from masters and not from slaves, obviously, with the exception of slave narratives. But in the French Caribbean, you have that kind of, so there's a way in which, that there's always the question of whose story gets foregrounded, although obviously they're super interesting, and they're often much more contradictory and complex. The case of Thistlewood's diary, it's been used to great effect in the British Caribbean as an example of things, of sources from the Prancer class that really highlight many of the contradictions of the colonial project itself. So.
Jennifer Cole has a really interesting book entitled Forget Colonialism about the memory of the 1947 insurrection in Madagascar, in which she makes the point that ritual sacrifices are really about empowering the ancestors and rewriting the colonial past in a way where the ancestors win. So this is a classic sort of rewriting history. Now, what's interesting to me about Greg's present piece that we're looking at is precisely that it doesn't use oral sources. I mean, you can sort of interrogate why that is vis-a-vis his previous pieces. I must say that personally, in some of my work, the question of interviewing somebody who was 7 years old in 1940, for instance, it really depends what you're trying to do with the source.
I would just say that what I understood Jim Searing to be doing was, that oral history is moved into a whole new realm of, being much more sophisticated, and so that you're actually asking people, and maybe this gets to Laurent's point about voodoo, but how the stories that have been handed down in their families, the memory has, that's what you're actually interrogating, is memory, which is oral history, obviously, but it's also a kind of much more layered understanding of, what what has been chosen to be passed on orally, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and in that sense, I mean, I think that the challenge there is to think of it almost like we debate other historians, right? I mean, there's questions of sort of what's highlighted, what's the emphasis, what's important, what's not important. It's kind of interesting that, I mean, in the corpus of Voodoo song, you have a huge corpus, like I'm talking about, like, you know, tens of thousands of songs. So there's it's also not individual memory, but it's kind of a collection of things. But then, of course, with formal mechanisms that are very, very different than what we're used to. So that's
Oh, we have a question here from Rachel Gillette, I think. Gillette. I've been really stretched and extended by my work in the history and literature concentration, where my colleagues take literary sources and poems very seriously, and language with tropes, and reading in ways that I have found very useful when combined with more standard historical sources. And then I always find music, especially where there are lyrics involved, to be very useful in that music is transmitted. It is uniquely local and yet gets circulated. There are stylistic aspects you can trace, just as we can trace idioms in linguistics. I think when we extend ourselves beyond the traditional sources, or the traditional source base, but use literary and musical sources very conscientiously, then we see movements of memory, resistance, local shaping, adaptation, and cross-cultural exchange, appropriation, in very useful ways. Yeah, so that furthers the idea that music and literary sources flesh out our understanding of the colonial experience in ways that the traditional, I think by traditional sources, she's referring to state documents. So this ties in with Voodoo song, for example, how it is used and who's using it, she adds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that history. Yeah.
I was just going to say, and sport, right? I mean, it gets to the long question of cultural, other cultural objects, right?
Which is actually a great, I mean, this is a wonderful segue. I'm conscious of the time. We've gone about halfway. So perhaps this would be a good moment to turn to Laurent's book. Do people agree?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, yep, absolutely.
So the question asked in advance was, in Soccer Empire, Laurent Dubois attempts to use the history of soccer to examine the history of empire. To what extent does a cultural object like sport allow us to see aspects of colonial and post-colonial history that other approaches do not?
Do you want me to say anything, or should I, or we'll just throw it out?
That might be a good start, yeah.
Well, maybe one way to take this is, did you have other models? What was your methodological inspiration for this approach?
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting because I didn't as much. When my earlier work, I felt like I had, but this was a little more experimental for me anyway, and it was, actually, the only reason I wrote that book is because I was so traumatized by the headbutt in the 2006 World Cup that I had to, like,
I remember it.
was like a therapy session, But then it
Imagine
also,
if you'd written it after the following World Cup.
right? Yeah, then I would have just, then there's no point to write anything. Yeah, but I did, and then I was struck. I mean, it's true that I had that experience and I started reading. And it struck me as an interesting disjuncture that everybody who studies France or who's spent any time in France sort of knows the 1998, World Cup victory was this major moment, and we all kind of know the narrative. And I was struck by the disjuncture between its hyper presence in people's memory and its lack of presence in academic writing. So I mean, partly I was amazed that there hadn't been that book written already, like 5 times, right? It's sort of an obvious picture. But then the other challenge was that. The space of sport as a kind of spectacle and as a very strange kind of public ritual and a very strange relationship to temporality where kind of like time gets almost condensed into this very intense experience, and people watching things that happen on a minute scale. Like all these things about how a sports event lays out, I felt like needed to somehow be incorporated, if that makes sense, into how one wrote it. I'm not sure if I was successful at that, but it struck me. And the other thing the reason I ended up being able to write it, I think, was because once I started reading into it, I realized that, you could talk about all these bigger historical facts of empire through sport, that it turned out, and I didn't know that going in. I didn't know that much about the FLN team or, these are other chapters in the books. But anyway, I didn't realize how much soccer had been kind of present, at these different moments, and so could be used as a tool. And so in that sense, there is a more traditional narrative trope, which is to use a particular form and see how it intersects with these bigger. And there I found other reference points. Obviously that's something I think a more common historical approach. But trying to figure out how to write about the historicity of an event like a soccer game, which is this absurdly, like on one hand, completely random, futile. It doesn't make any sense that people project that much importance on it, and yet, of course, they do, and so how to somehow negotiate that was part of the challenge. But anyway.
I just assigned your book to my graduate class, which is a graduate class on French history, but there's a great deal of colonial content, and they thoroughly enjoyed it. I actually had a question about that second chapter, which is the one we're focusing in on here. It seems to me that it's bookended by questions of Frenchness and Caribbeanness. You sort of begin with Marius Trésor, and then these question marks floated by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and others about, he's magnificently French. I've forgotten what the code is. Right. And then you end with the question of, should they be playing in CONCACAF? Should they? These players wanting to represent both France and their island. And right. When you're talking about the Caribbeanness of this team, you're very compelling. But then I started scratching my head and thinking about somebody like Thierry Henry, who comes up repeatedly, and you link him to La Désirade. I wonder to what extent Henry himself, feels his connection to La Désirade, or feels more of a connection to Paris. I'm wondering, in other words, about it generationally in terms of belonging, feelings of belonging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a...
Oh, lost you.
Oh, there. Okay. I think that's a great question, and of course, I think it generationally shifts a little bit. I have to say that I enjoyed writing that chapter partly because I had often been a little dissatisfied with it seemed to me, somewhat simplistic readings of the way that French Caribbean identity kind of functioned, right? So that people wanting to, so either it's a kind of a totally Caribbean identity or French identity, and it struck me that that soccer was a good way to see how these things could be, everything at once, and obviously people could kind of move between different strategies in a way that I think is truer in some larger sense in the French Antilles too. Like I did feel like I kind of had been in those societies enough to understand that this was also, I think, reflected a broader reality that people can, and I think Henri is a good example. Like, of course, he's very French, and he's very English, and kind of now a bit of a New Yorker, and but at the same time, he certainly refers in his interviews to his Caribbean background and to that kind of experience, and seems to be tied, although it's different from individual to individual how they articulate that. And that was the other thing. It did strike me as an interesting, it's a very select group, but sort of the way in which these individuals, and in the book, there's Thuram, there's later Karembeu in New Caledonia, and then of course Zidane in Algeria, and like you get a whole menu of different ways that you can have a complicated relationship to, being colonial and post-colonial. And so, if nothing else, I just wanted to give a sense of that variation. Even it's a pretty select group, but to render more complex that debate, and show. So I think there's a question.
Yeah, there is a question. Keith Rathbone. I love the book. I agree with the underlying role of generations in your story. How important was identity to earlier players such as Diagne or Ben Brack? I'm also interested in if you considered looking at other kinds of cultural consumptive objects practices.
I do think the earlier generation, it's kind of fascinating because, of course, it's a little different when someone, when there's two nations and you kind of operate between them. Although I do think that the contemporary Caribbean players can give us some sense about what it might have been like for Diagne and Ben Barek, right? They're kind of they had homelands that were part of France but also distinct, and how they navigated those. But I think it deserves probably more. I mean, those two figures I think are really fascinating too from that earlier generation. I think the cultural consumptive practices, I didn't really, just because I sort of had my hands full with with sport, but I think it would be great to think about, and obviously other historians have done that well as well. Certainly the realm of music and music production and that kind of stuff I think could lend itself to similar things, in the sense that you have objects that circulate with a kind of furious rapidity, you know, this sort of way that that a certain kind of consumption object, cultural object, can just move with lightning speed and then sort of illuminate certain things. And I think there are forms of music, and even in contemporary context, that we could think about, perhaps occupying a similar role. But I don't know if there are ideas out there about other types of, I mean, it would be interesting to think about whether this type of model could be used to interrogate, let's say, colonial and post-colonial France from other angles that that might be illuminating. So maybe Keith has ideas, or other people have ideas.
I have a different question, Laurent. I was just wondering, is this very much a francophone world only? In other words, not that isn't big enough in and of itself, but do the musical forms or the soccer players move beyond French, a kind of French metropole, or, that's where the money is and the careers are, and, is there a British Caribbean that's very much functioning also in a kind of almost autonomous, separate way from the French, or in the global sort of, world that we think of now, some of these linguistic barriers, or, linguistically determined choices, are they changing?
Well, this ties in with the question, the follow-up question that Keith Rathbone just asked. It ties in perfectly with what you just said, Alice. So is there a special story about soccer, since it's so global?
If I could add to that, you mentioned in the chapter, CLR James, on cricket. Does it tell a different story from cricket in the end? I'm actually unsure. Yeah. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, I always say there's right. Like, I think if you had to, you say you had to list the three, most widely shared cultural forms in the world, it would be capitalism, like Afro-American music, and then soccer. I don't know what order those you would put them in, but those are the three, these are three things. And soccer and cricket are definitely different, in the sense that cricket, while widespread in a certain way, is still pretty constrained in the end, where it exists, right? And we know this, that I recently finally figured out how cricket worked when I was in Barbados, but it's a smaller, whereas soccer really has this kind of absurdly universal quality, right? That it's sort of I do think the story is also very different from the 90s on and into the present, where I think you're totally correct that today many of these athletes live in a space that isn't French. I mean, it's not defined by, it's European in a certain way. They're moving within certain circuits. It's increasingly starting to incorporate Asia or Turkey or Russia. And within that, there's then these kind of subcultures developing, around the culture of athletics and the institutions and the market. Of course, all of this has to do with this kind of market that's shifting over time too, in which the power relations between Africa and Europe are still very important, in the sense that obviously certain players are in positions of exploitation, and others eventually manage to gain a certain power, but there's obviously big structures at work that are. So, I mean, there's a lot on the Soccer Politics blog. I've been trying to kind of just keep up with some of those things, and I'm going to post a piece soon that's about Qatar, for instance, and Qatari investment in French teams, and purchase, what happens when Qatar starts to buy French and Belgian teams, or buy into these teams. And, so we're talking about a real shifting of the terrain of power and capital and those sorts of things. So, I mean, I do think that the one thing that continues to be the case is that it's a very illuminating thing to look at soccer. Like, you can see that it's a good way to ask questions about some of these bigger structural changes now, obviously, although the structures are different, so the answers are different.
Yeah. It reminds me in a sense of, a book that came out, I believe it was in the 80s or early 90s, about sugar, mints, sweetness.
Sweetness and power, yeah.
Right. In that case, it's taking a commodity and then using it as a lens to see all these other processes, historical processes,
Right.
taking place
Yeah,
around
and that
it
book,
through it.
certainly that had been a very influential book for me, and probably was there as a kind of, even though the difference is that sugar probably has more power in a way than soccer, although I guess that's another question. But
It just the Keith's question and where Alice was going with the global. I was wondering, for historians who work on the nation and the nation state, global history challenges them to break down their boundaries with that and to look beyond the perimeter of the nation and the nation state. Do colonial historians feel the same way about global history? Because it invites you not just to look at the colonial space. It forces you to have to go beyond those borders and relate what's going on in one place to global processes more largely. Is there a sense among colonial historians that global history is something different, and it challenges them to think about history differently?
Do you want me to? I'll answer that, but others can jump in. I think, on some level, obviously colonial history is at least, it's pretty broad, and especially if you're taking something like the French Empire as a unit, you have to be pretty aware of it's pretty global. It's not the whole globe, but it's a lot of the globe, let's say. I do think that, at the same time, certainly, say, if you take Caribbean, studies that I know, you're always aware that on the one hand, again, the imperial desire to have control over certain spaces is undermined by all kinds of cross-imperial relationships, right? And that there's always kind of breaches between empires, and a site like the Caribbean is shaped over hundreds of years, like in very, very important ways, by people breaking the rules of empires, as North America is as well. So, you have to pay attention to the routes of connection and exchange as you find them. And I guess so you do come back to that. At the same time, I think global history, like Atlantic history, can be a term that means both everything and nothing. Like, it's hard to know sometimes what that actually means, right? And I think the one forceful thing you see is, of course, you have moves like someone saying the move to the Indian Ocean, just people reminding us that, there's a big world out there, and, lots of things were happening in lots of different places, and that sometimes we focus a lot on some or another. So that at least the globalization of history, but it seems to me what it tends to then lead to is looking at different locales in the end, right? And sort of, there's always these questions just of scale. I don't know what a truly global history would look like that wasn't also somehow, local or at least regional in a certain way. But that could be a question to throw out to people.
Yeah.
Jenna, can you go ahead and hit your transmit button?
Oh, okay. It was off for a while there. Can you hear me?
Are people hearing?
Yep.
Did somebody hear a hum?
Yeah.
There is a hum, yes.
Okay.
But I can hear Jenna.
Okay.
Yeah, I think about this question a lot as I was crafting my dissertation outline, I suppose, because I think as much as we're trying to get beyond national histories in some sense, as colonial historians, I think we have to insert ourselves into some historiography, obviously. We can't cover everything. And I feel like some of the books of colonial history that I read are primarily making a point about France. What does the empire say about France? Maybe Greg Mann, for example, is trying to do a social history that is more focused on what can we say about these sites in Africa? What can we say about these social relations? I think there's also maybe a desire to look at comparative empires, or what can thinking about empires say about the world or this particular moment or particular intellectual currents and things like that. And I think this is something as colonial historians that I think it's always a tension, and especially, to be frank, as graduate students heading into a tough job market, we have to, I think, be thinking about what kind of historians we are and what questions we're asking. And I think it's these questions, am I primarily doing French history or making some contribution to global history or African history? I think that's probably a tension in everyone's
Yes, it's almost a form of existential angst, isn't it? There's a way in which a lot of the readings that we did for today actually nicely bridge the gaps that we're talking about between French history and other kinds of history. Think of Laurent Dubois' book. Alice's article has an interesting bit on comparative empires. It seems to me that any colonial history is already comparative history. So the question is, how many comparisons do you layer on? And I take Laurent's point that at some point or another, when you're doing these global histories that are deeply interconnected, you do have to look at a single site as much as you want to look at trade routes and so on. As for the more cynical question that you just raised, Jenna, there is this sort of disturbing trend, it seems to me, on the part of some universities to try to, hire 2 historians for the price of 1, and thereby get somebody who does both, France in the world or Great Britain in the world or whatever it might be. So I think those are partly separate questions and partly they're linked. But yeah, the readings today, it seems to me, do bridge the gap. The question is, is there a tilt? So, is Gregory Mann's intervention more about France or more about Africa? I'll let you decide. Is Clifford Rosenberg's more about France or more about Algeria? Again, I've obviously got my answer, but I'll let you decide there as well. The space in between, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, Chuck, you asked whether about, the national, but I think in many ways, or for many of us, the colonial was a way of sort of perpetuating the national, right? I mean, and being sort of taking the national and expanding it, but still keeping, maybe that's it can be viewed as a weakness now that so I do think you do have to locate your, we who train graduate students think about this question. It's great to be global, but how are you going to train somebody to be global? And so you do have to root yourself in, and you don't have to root yourself in a national. There's a regional or a very local. So I think that it's a moment of transition, and maybe some of the questions that Jen is asking that graduate students should be asking or are asking themselves is, how can I move beyond the national, while still rooting myself in a place that will make whatever I'm doing coherent and manageable.
Which does, of course, touch on the job market insofar as you can ask yourself how many jobs really say Indian Ocean these days, or can you as a colonial historian aspire to apply to an area studies job outside of Europe? I think the answer, unfortunately, tends to be no more often than not. But.
Although, how many jobs are there in French history? Is the same question.
Well, that's the flip side.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, I think there's a dual problem, right, that people have that. On the one hand, the colonial opens up possibilities outside French history, but then it also might, it might challenge what you're going to do within. I mean, I always think about the fact that when like the first 3 books I wrote, people are always sort of saying, oh, you work on the Caribbean, and I do also point out that all these books are actually about France, right? That's sort of like the book about the Haitian Revolution is still about France. Like all these books stop in 1804, so they're before. The only book I've written that's not about France is the recent book that's a history of Haiti. And I like to point that, and it can be in other words, one could sort of describe them as very Franco-centric books, right? In that the questions about Frenchness and so forth are in a sense older questions about France and colonial studies. But I also think that the question of methods is another way to link up with diverse historiographies, in the sense that that these are questions that people are posing, certainly in British imperial history or in early American history or those sorts of things, and that is another. It's not a job market advantage, but it's an intellectual advantage that, we may be working in different areas, but we're participating in conversations about how you write certain kinds of histories. And in that sense, whether it's Indian Ocean historiography or others, that it's interesting how often the same problems come up, which is, okay, how do trade work? What was the raison d'être legal system in practice? I mean, those problems are also fairly universal within historical work. So that's, I think, important to recognize too. In some ways, we could be working a lot of different ways, but whether it's the national paradigm or not, there's methodological things that connect us a lot often. So,
there's a comment.
Yeah.
No, just to add to that, there's a comment by a student, Burley Hendrickson, There were no jobs in French history this year. It was basically transnational Europe or imperial history, with a few Europe and the world thrown
whatever
in.
that means. Yeah, and that's a trend. I mean, Eric is correct that there's sort of a cynicism to it. But it is also and the point about methodology I was just making is important as far as our graduate training, in the sense that obviously, the day of sort of like a French historian having a bunch of graduate students studying French history at one institution is pretty much past, and instead we're often on committees where we're working very much across areas, and therefore the methodological contributions are at least a place where we can help more sometimes than the very specific knowledge, and it also means our graduate students often are experts quicker than become experts in their own specific area beyond us rather quickly, since we can't be understanding all these areas. So.
Right.
Chuck, if I could bring in a question. Dorothy Bouquet wrote this to me, so I'll bring it on in.
Okay.
She mentions her specialty is in French cultural diplomacy, and she'd be interested in hearing how cultural policies could shape social classes in colonies or decolonized territories. She says that, oops, go back there. I know there was an institute in Egypt, and I'm wondering how neighboring French colonies were looking at the diplomatic cultural attention given to territories that were not colonies.
I'm not sure I completely understood the question.
Yeah, could you repeat that, David? Yeah, there's a lot of elements going on.
Okay. Interested in hearing how cultural policies could shape social classes in colonies or decolonized territories. I know there was an institute in Egypt, and I'm wondering how neighboring French colonies were looking at the diplomatic cultural attention given to territories that were not colonies.
Right. Yeah, I'll just quickly say, I do think that the whole history of the cultural policy of France globally, especially in the post-colonial era, is really interesting. And I think it deserves a lot more attention, especially because in terms of post-colonial migration, of course, like Chinese migration, say, or migration from other parts of the world to France is a huge, right? There's now, so like when we look at contemporary France, when we only look at post-colonial migration, we actually miss a lot of the very kind of intriguing cultural, cultural changes that are going on, notably, say, with parts of the Middle East that weren't necessarily ever French colonies and that kind of stuff. And certainly in post-colonial Africa and in a place like Haiti, the French cultural mission, the mission has had all kinds of interesting effects on kind of university and intellectual life. So.
I couldn't agree more, and I would actually bring it not just to the post-colonial, but to the colonial. Think of the number of Chinese workers in France during World War I. These are not colonial subjects. This is not a colonial project at all. And yet they work side by side with so-called, enemies, in other words, Vietnamese workers and workers from Morocco and so on and so forth. And then there's forms of soft power to consider, like the Alliance Française, of which there have been many histories, and that you can see as a sort of para-colonial endeavor, obviously. So I think this is a rich vein, but then there's also the complicated question of what's a colony, right? Cameroon, Togo, Morocco, Tunisia, not colonies, not run by the Ministry of Colonies. How do you grapple with this? How seriously do you take the protectorate and mandate status?
You could bring in here too, not only, and I'm thinking JP's article on Argentina, and which is the Alliance Française, or missionaries. Global Catholicism is a term that seems to be emerging as a kind of different way of talking about cultural policies that are not only colonial, but then it sort of breaks down what's specific to the colonial in a cultural mission. So looking at the non-colonies is actually an interesting proposition, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And with respect to J.P. Dotton, he at once takes seriously the autonomy of these missionaries, but also interrogates the ways in which they saw themselves working for France. So both edges of the sword, so to speak. There's an echo all of a sudden. I'm not sure if everybody's getting it.
Yes, I'm hearing an echo as well.
I'm getting it, but I can't figure out where it's coming from.
Because it seems to be for everybody. It's an egalitarian echo. We all have it.
It's a Republican echo. That's good.
There we go.
I do think that the, I mean, I've been thinking about this. I'm Belgian originally, and I've been thinking lately about like what would a Belgian, sort of post-colonial Belgian story, partly because it may be that the Belgians will qualify for the World Cup and France won't in 2014 in Brazil, so I'll have to pick a new team. But in all seriousness, like if you're looking at you look at sort of post-colonial Belgium, if you can call it that, it's of course shaped, as much by Turkish migration or something. Of course it has something to do with the Congo, but it also has to do with these other. And it's intriguing to take societies like that and to think, So and then when you do that, then you go back to France and realize that to some extent we do, we focus on certain stories to the neglect of others. And literature helps redress that, since obviously like Chinese French literature is a huge thing, right? There's all these kind of interesting writers coming out, and so that's a good corrective to us to remember that while as important as the Algeria France story is, it's one among many stories, and that can even help us get back to. I mean, when I was writing the soccer book, getting back to the Portuguese and Italian histories of migration, which are sometimes overshadowed but are integrated into the history of, say, the banlieue and those sorts of things. So that's interesting too. And in some ways, it actually gets us back into European questions as well. So.
I love the bit about one of the players wanting to go to Corsica because that too was an island. I've forgotten who it was.
Right. Yeah, it's Marius Trésor. He gets his first. He's like, oh, that's good. Yeah, it'll be one sort of French island.
One wonders how he was received, but that's a whole other set of pressure.
Yeah, that's another question.
We have an observation
here.
From Nir Abissar in her book Framing the Nation, documentary film in interwar France. Alison Levin discusses reception of colonial subjects of documentary films. Are you familiar with that film?
You cut out for a minute. What did you say?
I think it's Levine.
The film,
Alison Levine.
The book is. I'm sorry. Alison Levin's Framing the Nation, documentary film in interwar France. This book discusses the reception of colonial subjects of documentary films. Levine, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that book, but so maybe we can hear more about it, or I don't know if others have read it.
Was there a question or just a comment?
It was just a comment. Nir, if you would like to if you have a microphone.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. It's an interesting book because first it treats a source that is not often considered by historians, and that is the visual. I personally study photography, but Alison Levine does a very good job studying documentary films, pedagogic and so forth. And it seems like an interesting way to explore the term that was used here before, cultural diplomacy, which I didn't understand entirely what it meant because it's pretty abstract. So it seems that kind of source can be one aspect of such cultural diplomacy.
Yeah, it's an excellent book. I am familiar with it.
And I would say just another short comment, and that is the difference between film and photography, because film allows you to all sorts of reasons, historians more easier way to study reception.
Which actually brings me to one of the suggestions of one of my graduate students when reading your book, Laurent, which is that it should be interactive and you should be able to click to see on some of the plays how them come to life.
Right.
I'm not sure how that would actually work.
Well, that's actually why I started a blog, because on the blog you can watch, you can watch the play that I'm talking about, and it's true that it's a kind of, So I would love that actually, that you could. It would be especially like an iPad version where you could kind of click and embed the videos of these sorts of things. So in place of sort of like, then he ran down the field, blah blah blah.
Struck it into the top corner, right?
Yeah, There's a comment here. Rachel says, and we can turn this question of cultural policy around and ask what claims colonial subjects and citizens wanted to make on France and how they defined their Frenchness. Very good point. How they write about French culture. Damas, French, that the French speak. Which soccer teams do Francophone groups support? Which hip-hop do they listen to? Also, Liz Forrester discusses religion in this context of cultural policy and the tension between African Catholics on the ground and the superstructure of the church. These are all good points.
Charles Keith does much the same with respect to Vietnam and Vietnamese Catholics and taking their perspective seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, in the 2010 World Cup, there was this interesting case of an Algerian team that was entirely French, basically, right? In other words, like literally every Algerian player had grown up in France and was double nationality. And so you have these, you do have a lot of cases of people kind of, taking on these different roles, and I think making kind of certain demands on their own nation, like on the Algerian nation as well as on France, and all the kind of dynamism around. Also, I mean, in the French case, then all these stories. I mean, some of them I tell them in the book of booing, of basically French people going to root for Algeria and booing the French national anthem at a certain point, and how that plays out. And I think the realm of, and there are some good studies coming out to some extent of French music and hip hop and so forth, but that's a huge area, right, where you have another zone where one could, I think, take a very similar approach of seeing how, even, and now we're deep enough into it that there's a history to be written of, the 1980s, the role that the kind of quota requiring a certain amount of French music be played on the radio actually played, and the rise of French hip hop, and these kind of, again, there are things that remind me a little bit of earlier colonial experiments of the kind of unexpected consequences of certain cultural policies and people taking advantage of them. And, there's stuff to be written there just about the 80s and 90s in France that, now that it's 2013, we can consider properly historical, I guess, that are really interesting about the way that cultural policy, the Mitterrand era, kind of decentralization policies and their effect in the French Antilles, for instance. I mean, all these things, they're topics I think that are really interesting, that could learn to some extent from some of the colonial, approaches, but are obviously about a slightly different set of things and about, sort of post-war French society and all its complexity. So.
Your comment, Laurent, about the Franco-Algerian soccer game and the booing of the French national anthem reminded me of the discussion that you have about singing the national anthem to begin with. And this is something that's ongoing, right? As you no doubt know, Karim Benzema has been criticized for not singing the Marseillaise and said he won't. Which actually gets me to the sort of to tag on to the question that was just posed to us. Is there the same tradition of belting out the national anthem in French sports culture to begin with, or is this a 1980s far-right construct? Or is it an American import?
Right. Well, it was interesting because I wrote a piece about the Benzema sort of intervention where he sort of said he wouldn't sing, and of course a bunch of people pointed out that like the American soccer team, about a fourth of them sing the national anthem apparently.
Right.
If you go around and start watching whether people sing the national anthem. Also, frequently the French president during the national anthem isn't singing the national anthem, just as another example. Although
which I think
rarely
gets
called out.
Actually. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the idea that you have to sing, of course, doesn't. No, I mean, so much of this, and I do try to in Soccer Empire, I do try to lay this out that a lot of this really is the result of Le Pen's, politicizing this issue in the mid-90s and turning it into a question that, that would become a kind of touchstone. And it's such an obvious way to, it's obviously a very clever way of kind of raising issues of belonging and potential treason and a kind of racialized way of raising these things. Although I do try to argue in the book that it was a kind of weird miscalculation to some extent on, like, the other question is why the French soccer team is a political symbol at all, because you could just, there are a lot of countries in which the soccer team is the soccer team and people are happy if it wins, but it doesn't mean anything specific about the country necessarily. I mean, it doesn't have to carry with it some sort of political message that a soccer team wins other than that the country's great or whatever. And it's really Le Pen who helped make the French soccer team specifically a certain kind of political symbol by criticizing its multi-ethnicness, and also pushing a number of players to then take political stances that I think many of them probably wouldn't have otherwise, and probably didn't really want to, So it's a kind of, there is I think it seems to me there was a kind of somewhat of a backfiring, even though, it's also, it works for him in some contexts, but it also seems to have, it created a possibility for a symbolic terrain that otherwise might have been sort of thinner in some ways. Because as I point out in the book, like every French national soccer team has been multiracial since like the 1920s, but only in the 1990s did that become a symbol of something, highly significant for people. So.
Interesting. Yeah, we only have about 7 minutes left, and I thought it might be good to get on to the question of teaching, and to Alice's. There's a comment here by Keith Rathbone. Of course, there's a long history of national teams being politicized, even in France. Several important examples from around the Second World War. It seems that sports teams can serve as a discursive terrain for social and political issues, which is, yeah. Do you want to, Eric or Alice, do you want to, or Laurent, talk about, speak to the issue of teaching? Teaching as we have future professors listening, I'm sure, thinking about how you teach the colonial, imperial, and history is really important.
There's two different syllabi here, relying on novels, and obviously they were created at a slightly different time. They're trying to do slightly different things. I was really interested by both syllabi's use of fiction, actually, and wanted to know, how this works in the classroom, how Assiette Bar is received, for instance. But perhaps there are other questions about teaching that we can turn to. Comparing the two syllabi is a good place to start.
I can just say, mine is taught in Romance Studies and in a French department, actually. So it's a literature, not a history department, of course. And so, I might use more history and maybe in a different setting, although I like the use of novels. And I'll just, as a little anecdote, the first time I taught it, we taught Lynn Hunt's book, and Lynn happened to be coming to Duke, and so she visited our class early on, and it was what she sort of had to say is just like, you might think that this is like a normal way to teach French history, to have these kind of global interactions. And this is a way of saying she had to kind of explain to the students that, that there was these other ways of teaching national European history, because so few of them had actually encountered those other ways of doing it, right? That, you would have, so there is this kind of interesting problem that we're facing about the lack of certain foundations. So, and sometimes we go too quickly to the critique, and I find I'm always having to backtrack and say, there is, here's the sort of history of the French Revolution. That I'm going to give you, and then I can tell you that there's other things to know as well. So that's a kind of the problem of, I think the problem of expanding the canvas is also that we can't depend much on much foundation to start with. So that's always a struggle I have about, But anyway, I don't know if Alice wants to jump in.
Well, I haven't taught my history of imperialism in the novel for years. That was a seminar that I taught early on in my career. And actually that's sort of a trip down memory lane to read that article, because it reminded me of some of the things I've been teaching long ago. I think that, and I have the same problem, that there's no foundation if you teach just through novels. And I was trying to walk students through sort of moments of change in colonial context, and it was a struggle. But I love using novels in a lecture course where I'm giving them the background and the narrative. But
right.
My examples were sort of two extremes. One very traditionally chronological, history course, in which I tried to integrate the empire, and then a comparative. But I really enjoyed in that novel course also putting in Dutch Indonesia, having the British in India, the Dutch in Indonesia, and the French in Africa. Of course, I didn't get the Caribbean, and so now I think you could probably do it in a very interesting way all over again, because there's so many more books translated.
It seems to me that the French Caribbean lends itself to a literary approach between Marie Condé, Chamoiseau, Confiant. All these are terrific historical novels to draw from.
Yeah, and I mean, what it worked well for me is to take the problem of history as a sort of central topic of the course, and then when you read something like Texaco and then read something like Asiya Jabbar, you can at once be doing kind of Caribbean and Algerian stuff, but then you have something to hang on to, right, which so that they can grapple with texts that are quite complicated too, and then bring in historical materials, historical texts to sort of show them how the authors have incorporated certain kinds of documents. So then you kind of those novels allow you to kind of get the best of both worlds, which is like primary sources, exposing your students to some primary sources while also giving them a kind of narrative that would be, it's actually harder to do that to assign monographs or, to do that in a way. There's one module that I think in the version I sent wasn't there, but that works really well, which is to use the Usman book, who's that now I'm blanking on, about the railroad strike.
Right.
Le Bout de Bois de Dieu,